First, I'll tell some things I remember hearing about Daddy when he was a little boy. I know that he was, of 6 children, there was 1 girl and 5 boys, and Daddy was 17 years younger than his nearest brother. So, of course, you know that he was probably spoiled. I remember him telling something about when he was just a little boy. His mother was kind of switching him with a switch, and he'd jump when she'd hit him and say, cut that out, Ma. Cut that out now, Ma. And just then his father come by and watched for a few seconds, and he said, give me that. And he said, cut that out, Pa, just one time, and after that he was too busy. Some of the things that Daddy told me really hit something in my own head because I did the same sort of things. Like once when he said that he thought that maybe they had abused him or something, how he laid out and thought that he might die. He looked at the sky and thought how sorry they'd all be. I've done that too. But then he told me too about going to school where he was one little white boy and there was about 17 Indian boys. My, what a dangerous life he led that time. He said one time there was a knock at the door and his father answered, and it was a man saying that Daddy had insulted his daughters. And so Grandpa said, James? And he came in there and he said, James, he said, is this true? Have you been insulting those girls? Did you tell them to let him you see their pants? And he said, well, yes. He said, they kept telling me that I had holes in my pants. And I said, well, let me see yours. Maybe they have holes too. And Grandpa just said, well, I don't see anything wrong in that. And the man just looked funny and went away. Many things, they just come in little snatches and grabs to me. But I remember Daddy telling about going and taking his cattle down to water, and there was a fence. Somebody had put up a fence where it shouldn't have been to cut off his stock from water. So he took it down and watered his stock. And pretty soon he began hearing about town that that man that had put up the fence was going to kill him, that he was telling everybody that he intended to kill him. And so Daddy said, I just decided I wasn't going to worry all the time about him laying in wait for me and killing me. And he said, I just went down to his house and walked in. And I said, well, I hear that you plan on killing me, and if you're going to, get it over with. And he said, the man just kind of growled and said, well, you had no business taking down the fence. And he said, you had no business putting it up. And that was the last I remember of that event. Now I guess I better say something about Mama. Mother was the preacher's daughter. She was the middle child. There was 3 boys and 4 girls, and she was the middle one. They were supposed to be good kids, but I've heard about PKs, preacher's kids. Anyway, she said that she was full of mischief. She's told me many things about the things that she did, like the time that they were playing in the cotton, after it had been picked. She was playing in the cotton, and she said that they'd got lots of it outside of the bin where it was supposed to be. And she said when that night somebody came to see them, and her dad, and they mentioned that how she's getting to be such a big girl. And her dad said, yes, and she's a good girl. She said she hasn't done anything wrong today at all. And she said that really caused her to repent. She felt terrible about that. Also, one time she was playing and she stuck a pin down along the backbone of a calf that they had. And she said every time that she did it, it would rear up and go brr, and bellow a little. And she thought that was funny. But she said that night she could not sleep. Said she kept thinking of that poor thing. And she said Finally, she got up in the night, and she was very cowardly, but she said she got up in the night and went down there. And she said she felt along the backbone, and every place that she had put a pin, it was swollen. And she said she took out every one of those before she went home. Being preacher's children, sometimes when they played church. And Mama said she remembered preaching one sermon, and her little sister Ida came up to the altar when she gave the altar call, and said she was crying and praying, and she really did get saved that time. Mama said the preacher of the day surely felt funny that time, half afraid. It is in fact that children that are brought up around the church often play like they're preaching or something like that. But Aunt Ida claimed that she was saved in a child service all the days of her life, and she was a very good Christian. Mama said one time when they were working out in the field that an older sister, Aunt Clemmy, attempted to punish Mama for something that she had done. She grabbed up a stalk of some kind and said, "Lord, give me strength to punish this wicked girl." And Mama grabbed up another stalk and said, "Oh, devil, give me strength." I make Mama sound terrible, I guess, but it's not true. She was a mixture of good and bad, just like the rest of us. Mama said Aunt Clemmy was sometimes afraid of the dark. They had to carry their water from a spring or a stream that was a little ways away from the house. And one time, it was after dark, and they told Clemmy and Mama to go and get some water. And Clemmy was afraid, and so she had Mama go and get it. But Clemmy worried, because she was sweet and she worried about Mama, and so she would come and peek out. And Mama saw her peeking out there. So she set down her buckets of water, and she ran around and she got some kind of a thing and threw it over her head and stood sort of in the chimney corner. And the next time that Aunt Penny looked out, Mama said, "Ooh," and bent over a couple of times. And Aunt Penny ran, running in, and Mama ran and got her pails of water then and came in. And Aunt Clemmy said, "Oh, Nan, I saw an angel." Mama said it was sure more than an angel, something less than an angel. I guess Mommy always was a character. When she was a little girl, she said she could never remember when she didn't know how to read. And she started to school awfully early, they did in those days. She was about 5. And she said that she heard them all talking about some of the kids in school had lice. And one day she found, on their way to school, she found a bug on her, and she began to yell, "Oh, I got a rouse, I got a rouse." And her sisters looked at it and said, "Oh, Nan, that's a tick." And she said, "I know it is a rouse. See it wriggle its legs." I think, before I leave Aunt Clemmy altogether, I'd like to tell her story. All my life I thought of her as my auntie that died of a broken heart. She was a very tender-hearted Christian girl, and when she was young she started going with a young man named Frank. She thought she was in love, and she became engaged to him. He felt that he had to go away and seek for work away from there, and so he was gone for about a year. Well, Aunt Clemmy, along with other young people, was thrown more and more into the company of another young man named Frank. And she began to feel that she was in love with him. And so she wrote to the first one and asked him to release her from her promise. Instead of doing that, he came right home and told her no, he wasn't going to release her, that they would have to get married right away. And so, although she knew she was in love with the other fellow, she still kept her promise to marry that one. Seems so funny to anyone nowadays that someone would hang to such a promise when they knew that it was wrong. Mama said she remembered Aunt Clemmy telling her, never, Nanny, never go with two boys at the same time. But anyway, when she was married, she had such long, abundant hair that they combed it out, and it completely covered her wedding gown. And she was married, and both of the young men were there, of course, the one she married and the one she loved. And right after the ceremony, they left supposedly on their wedding trip. But that night, along in the night, he brought her back, and she was burning up with fever. And Grandma put her to bed and started taking care of her. But she couldn't come out of whatever was wrong. They never found out that she just had a high fever. And once she said, "Oh, Frank, Frank," and her husband leaned over her and she said, "Not you, not you." And then she died and one of her friends writing about her in her obituary said Clinty was one of our sweetest Christian girls. And she said, just 10 days from the day she stood before us, a lovely bride, we laid her in the tomb. That used to seem to me like a most romantic story when I was a child. But I can't help but think that it was a great waste nowadays. No doubt many things will come to me as I go along that I don't remember right now, and I'll put them in as they come. This account of Mama's and Daddy's romance came entirely from Mother. She said that her sister Nora was going with a young man named John, and he was always trying to get someone to go with her because they didn't allow their girls to go anywhere alone, and so they always had to have Mama along as an extra. But he did get boy after boy, but Mother always managed to do something ornery to them and never did like them. She said there was a mud puddle that they always had to go around, and she said she'd walk a little closer and a little closer to the boy that she was with until finally he stepped in that mud puddle. Wasn't that mean? Finally, Uncle John asked her how would she like to have a date with little Doty. That's what he called my daddy. And she said, "Oh, I'd like that fine." And she thought that's the one she had been wanting to go with all the time. So she happened to look up and see Uncle John pointing Daddy out, pointing her out to Daddy. And she said she winked at him. And then she went back to singing, and she knew that he looked and looked, but she didn't wink at him anymore. But anyway, then he asked her if he could see her home, and they started out walking. And she tried walking a little closer to him as they got nearer to this mud puddle, but all he did was walk a little closer to her. And finally he said, you have pretty curly hair." And she said, "Yes, and it's natural, see?" And she knelt down for him to feel of her hair, even though she'd put him up on rags the night before. She said, "You have curly hair too." He said, "Yes, I put mine up on rags." That was my daddy. He couldn't be beat. I used to sit for the hour and listen to them tell tales about when they were young. I remember when she told about Daddy. He had to go away somewhere, and it was to a city, and while he was there, he heard a phonograph. And nobody had ever heard of him around there where they lived. And when he came back, he tried to tell Mama about the voice that came out of this little box. And she just wouldn't believe it. She thought that he was just trying to act like she was ignorant, and so she wouldn't believe it. And she hurt his feelings because she wouldn't believe him when he said he was telling the truth. And so then finally, to make up with him, to make him feel better, she let him kiss her. And she didn't know that Uncle Bud was listening all the time. That was Mom's brother. Anyway, she worried and worried about that. And she said, she told Uncle Bud the next day, "Bud, I let Jim kiss me last night." And he said, he jumped up and he said, "You're a ruined chicken." And so she said she thought she was. So she wrote Daddy a letter and told him that if he'd forgive her, she'd never let it happen again. Somehow she was able to see when he rode to the post office, and she saw him riding past and going to the post office when she knew he'd get that letter. And instead of turning towards home, he came right towards her place. And he came in, and they told him that Mama was upstairs. And he stood at the foot of the stairs, and he said, Nanny, come down. I'll never forgive you. She should have known that Uncle Bud knew all about that and that he didn't think it was too awful bad. Because she said when she did kiss Dad, that he said, I guess I'll go get Martha. Daddy was not a big man in stature, but he was a big man. I remember we used to say Daddy was little, but he was mighty. And we sure meant it, because he never told us anything or promised us anything that he didn't do it, whether it was good or bad. Mama had to punish me often. I remember we lived near some willows, and we'd have to go and cut our own willow stick for her to switch us with. And often I have seen the blood cut out of my legs where she'd switch me with that. In those days, we knew that we were switched because we needed it. We never thought of acting like that we were abused children. We weren't. We were well loved. But Daddy, I can only recall 3 times that Daddy gave me a switching, and each time I knew exactly why he did. When Mom and Dad were married, for some reason, they went away from home to be married, and I don't believe that Grandpa performed the ceremony. And the only one of Mama's family that was present was Aunt Pearl, and she was kind of a snip of a girl. And anyway, when they came down the receiving line, Aunt Pearl kissed Daddy, but she slapped Mama. I've never understood that. However, knowing Aunt Pearl, it's not too far-fetched. I want to talk a little more about Mama's family. They lived next to a Bohemian family for a long time there in Oklahoma. And one of the boys, whose name I can't remember, claimed Mama. He always said, "That's mine Holka." He says, "That's my girl." And from one another they learned many words. And Mama said that from some of the words that were said at their table by those Bohemian children caused Grandpa to look at his boys like he knew that it was them that had been telling them those wrong words. And I've often wondered what kind of things the Bohemians heard at their table by those preachers' kids. As a kid, I used to feel so smart-aleck because of the Bohemian words I learned from Mother. I remember saying to some of the kids, and they didn't know what I was saying, but I was saying, "Good morning, sweetheart, give me a kiss." I know Piekani Holka was pretty girl, and a few other phrases that I won't bore you with right now. I remember a story about Grandpa Doty, Daddy's father. Daddy had lots of stories about his dad. To him, his dad was well-nigh perfect. He could do so much with his children, and I think that Daddy tried to copy him in raising us. But anyway, Grandpa had a prize rye field that he was very proud of, and the neighbor had a rooster that would not stay out of it. It would fly over the fence and make a mess in Grandpa's rye. He kept telling that neighbor, "I'm going to kill him if you don't keep him home." But nevertheless, one day that rooster had made a particularly bad mess in his rye field, and he wrung his neck and threw him over the fence. Then later Grandpa began to feel ashamed and sorry. He was a Christian, and he was sorry of that. And so he thought he had to go over and apologize to his neighbor. And so he started. But when he got over there, his neighbor was sitting on his back step, and he had that chicken in his hands. And when he saw Grandpa, he began to sing, "Alas, and did my chicken bleed, and did my rooster die? Did he devote that proud old head for scratching up Doty's rye?" I always thought that was funny. I don't know. I remember my daddy sometimes made little songs about Christian songs, and I know that he loved the Lord. But I remember him saying, "Jesus, lover of my soul, lead me to the sugar bowl." As a young couple, Mom and Dad lived fairly close to the Indian reservation, the Cherokees. All my life, I've been told that the Cherokees were a good-looking race, pretty people. And the 2 or 3 that I have known were. But anyway, they had their house built so that when the Indians rode off the reservation, they passed quite close to them. And they didn't have a front door yet. They had tacked up a quilt that they'd throw back over the top some way so that they could get some air. And I could tell you the story of why the Indians went on the warpath and why Daddy was gone. In those days, Daddy belonged to the vigilantes. They had to have them because there was horses stolen and nobody to take care of such things. And so they formed the vigilantes to look them up and make them afraid to take these things. And Daddy happened to be gone in search of his own horse this time. Someone had stolen his, and the vigilantes were out looking for his. But anyway, there was a half-breed Indian and another. They kept going to some woman's house, and they'd ask her for first one thing and then another, and she always gave them what they asked for. And finally, they came back and asked for something that she just couldn't give them, and so they killed her. And when the little girl she wasn't very old, but she walked 5 miles to the nearest neighbor. It took her a long time. And they went back with her, and the baby had crawled out in the yard and was trying to nurse. And they found the mother dead there, where she'd been tomahawked. And anyway, they matched the shoe prints that were all over the place with this man. He had a boot on, and it was run over, and it just exactly fit that. And they found the two that were always together, and they burned them at the stake. And when they had done this, the Indians went on the warpath. And Mama said one time when she was sitting in that doorway trying to get a little air, and she had Tommy, my little brother, sitting there on this thing, pallet there, because it was so hot in the cabin with everything closed off. And she said, this Indian rode up and leaned down and looked in at her and said, "Where's your man?" And she said, "Oh, he's around somewhere. Do you want him?" And he just grunted and rode on. And then they didn't molest Mama at that time. And Daddy did find his horse. And he went to a certain cabin, an Indian dwelling, with he and these other men, and they told him what they were looking for. And they said, well, he wasn't there, but his mother was dying. And so he went in, and there was this Indian woman on the bed and evidently dying. And so they looked all around, but they didn't find him. And later, one of the others told Daddy he was under his mother's bed the whole time. In his youth, Daddy had danced with the Indians and enjoyed it. Mother never danced. After all, she was a preacher's kid, and she never learned to dance. But Daddy, in his youth, before he met Mama, had done that. And there was even some children named after Daddy because they did like him a lot. But anyway, Daddy was saved under Grandpa's ministry. Some of the tales Daddy used to tell were a little bit sickening to me. Once he said that they'd eat at the Indian campfire when they were out doing their work as vigilantes. And he said one place he thought that it was particularly good. And when they rode away, the other fellow said to him, "You know what you ate tonight, Jim?" And he said, "No, but it was good, wasn't it?" He said, "Well, it was dog." That makes me sick. Some of Mother's tales were sickening, too. I remember when she told about one of her sisters coming in from the field where they'd been working. They had to work in the field. There were 6 girls and only 3 boys, and they were needed. And so she said when they came in, that she drew up a pail of water and drank, and then she immediately turned deathly sick, and she vomited. And out of this got up a spider and walked away. And they thought that it was the spider, that she had swallowed the spider, and that was what it was. I don't know whether that was true, whether that was really the spider or not. But I do know that to this day I can't stand spiders. And I do lay it to that very tale. When I was little, I used to spit when I saw a spider until there was just no spit left in me. I don't know what I thought I was doing. The next story I have to tell, I kind of hate to tell. They said that as a young married couple, they had the cutest little dog that was so smart, and it would go with them to the field and with them while they worked in the cotton all day. But anyway, Mama did work in the cotton field with Daddy. Although before they were married, he'd looked at her hands and told her, Nanny, those little hands will never have to work anymore. And yet, the first time that he went to the cotton field, he said, Nanny, why don't you get your sack and come along and keep me company? To get back to the little dog, they said that if they said they were going to go down to Ma's and Pa's the night before, when they got there the next day, the little dog was already there. And they enjoyed that so much, and of course that was their first pet together. But one day, a rabid dog came by, and they saw it, and the little dog went out to bark at it at first, and then as soon as it got a real good look, it tried to hide. It ran under the house, but that dog had seen it and went too, and was under the house with the little dog. And Mama said that the floorboards in their house were wide enough between that she could kind of see them fighting and under there. And she said her little dog cried, and it was so terrible, and they didn't have a gun in the house. And finally, they got word some way to someone that came by, and they called and said that they needed a gun and what was wrong. And this person ran and jumped into the cabin with the gun, and they shot the mad dog under the floor. I don't know how they got it out. I don't remember that part of the story. But they did say that the little dog, when it came out, that its skin was all loose and kind of dragging behind it. And of course they did have to kill it. I'm sorry, that was a bad story. Tales like that one caused me to detour around many dogs in my early years. When Mama and Daddy were first married, they lived for a while with Daddy's folks. Mother didn't really like to live there. She said Aunt Nan bothered her. She was an old maid at the time, and she seemed to resent Mama, and she bossed her quite a little bit. Mama said that Grandma, Daddy's mother, was an invalid. She was a small woman and very sweet. Mom, every time they had family worship at night, she prayed for dying grace. Somehow, being an invalid, I suppose, caused her to think of death, and she wanted to be ready. And I'll tell right now that when she was dying, she did know she was dying. For 3 hours, they were all grouped around her, and she talked to them and told them that she was going to be with the Lord, told them that she could see the gates of the city. And when they had to stoop to listen and put their ear close to her mouth to hear what she was saying at the last, her last words, she was praying for her son, the one that wasn't yet saved. She was saying, "Oh God, save John." I know how much smoking is frowned on now, and I too could not do it when I was trying to serve the Lord. I know that I think that it's wrong. But my grandmother smoked a corncob pipe. I don't think anybody ever told her or mentioned that they thought it was bad. And she didn't find it in the Bible, and neither can you. And when she was dying there, they said that she held, the pipe wasn't filled or anything, but she held the bowl of it in her hand because it kind of comforted her. Daddy's father then only lived a little while after she died, and he had always said that he had an angel that come and told him when any important thing in his life was going to come to pass. And one day he came by where Mother was. They had moved to themselves by then. And he came by where Mother was, and he sat and talked to her. And she remembered him drumming his fingers on the table. And he said, "Well, Nanny, my angel came again last night," and she said the next time she came would be the call. And he went out across the field and dropped dead from a heart attack. Now that I've told you what really happened to Grandpa and Grandma, I don't want to leave them yet. I remember Daddy telling about when he was a little boy, and they were going to town together, Ma and Pa. And that was so unusual to them that he could remember dancing around and saying, Ma and Pa is going together, khaki, khaki, khaki. Imagine that. It was from his father that he got the idea that children were supposed to mind. And in those days, they did give their parents respect. Even when they themselves were married, they still respected the authority of that man. Daddy said he could remember some of them shucking corn over a wagon bed. Said one was on one side and one on the other, and his father was at the end of it. And he said those two were kind of jawing one another back and forth about something. And he said all at once his father just raised his two fists up and held them between them, and he said, shut up, both of you. I'll hit you right in the mouth. And there wasn't another word spoken. Samuel Binder Doty was Grandpa's name. I don't exactly know the order of the children. I do know that Grandma had been married before. She was a widow when Grandpa married her. And by that marriage, she had one child, Uncle Henry. Then there was Arch and John and Will. And I don't know where Aunt Nan came in. There was only one girl. And then James, my dad. Those grandparents I never knew. They both died before I was born. I don't believe any of us remember them. But Daddy was the child of their old age. In Mama's family, Grandpa's name was Thomas Mansker, and Grandma's name was Martha. They called her Matt. She had been a steward, and she said she remembered when she was a girl and the Civil War was on. She remembered standing out when they saw the Union soldiers come by, because of course they were Southerners, and she saw the Union, and she sang with the other girls as hard as she could sing about Dixie. And then one young captain of the Northern Army came back and tried to get Grandma to marry him, and she said no, she wouldn't marry a Northerner. Why she was so mad at him was because they had taken their horses. They had commanded their horses, but he didn't take hers because she was so angry and so determined. He did leave her own special mount. Some of Mama's relatives did have slaves. I remember hearing that Grandma had a nanny that she loved, and when the slaves had their choice and some could leave, some wouldn't go. And this nanny especially lived with them until her death. Before I forget it, Grandpa Doty's lawyer was Abraham Lincoln. In Mama's family, Aunt Della was the oldest child. And then, I'm not sure whether it was Aunt Nora or Aunt Clemmy. And then there was Aunt Pearl and Aunt Ida and Mama, of course. And with the boys, there was Uncle Seth, Uncle Bud, and Uncle Jet, and he was the baby of the family. I forgot to say that Grandma Mansker, before she was married, was a Stewart. In fact, I've heard in later years that we were descendants of Mary, Queen of Scots, but I don't. We're Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, but I'm not sure I believe that. The soil in Oklahoma, at least where Mama lived, was red clay, and they could mold it into the shapes of animals. And my mother was very talented. She could make cows that looked like cows and horses that were horses. And I think that's what she was doing that time Aunt Clemmy decided she was going to thrash her. I think she was leaving her work and going over there and sculpting a little. Grandma Mansker had a sister who married a man quite a bit older than herself, but they had 15 children. He died and left her with those children to support, but in just a little while they discovered oil on her land, and she was a real wealthy woman. I remember Daddy telling about his father and some man having a dispute over some property line or something, and rather than just go on with such a thing, Grandpa just suddenly moved them all to Kansas. Daddy had been going with Mama when he went, but they didn't stay too long in Kansas. They came back, and I guess whatever it was that was wrong got straightened out. Maybe some of the other girls will remember this better. But I think Daddy was a little boy the time that he saw sitting outside of a store in a wagon a woman with a rifle on her lap, and someone told him that that was Jesse James' wife, and that he was in that store. I know that Daddy said that her eyes never stopped, that they just looked and watched everybody on the street, and as though she was kind of haunted, and had to keep watch out of fear. While I'm thinking of it, I'll tell you something about Tommy. I understand he had one brown eye and one blue one, and that they were just as clear, both of them, that he was a very pretty child, and of course they were both so crazy about him. They had lost one child, Crystal. She had been born in that first little house where they lived, and that's where she died. She only lived 6 weeks. Tommy died later after they had moved out to Idaho.
They both died of pneumonia?
No, I don't know what Crystal died of. I think it had something to do with the woman that took care of her getting her cow's milk, and the cow was about to dry up. It had something to do with stomach trouble.
Oh.
But Tommy died of pneumonia when he was 18 months old.
Oh, I can tell it. I remember Grandma said that she looked out and she saw him sitting in a mud puddle, just splashing water.
No, he was laughing and he sat down in it.
Is that how it was? And anyway, that's how he got the pneumonia.
She should have been cesarean. They said that she was in labor for so many days, and when she was born, Mother was torn clear together, and her pelvis bone was broken, and she was in quite an awful shape. And Crystal only lived 6 weeks, and therefore they didn't get as used to her as they did to Tommy. It was so much harder to give Tommy up at 18 months. In fact, Mother said that for almost 3 years she was not herself. She'd walk to her mother's and back, and turn around and walk right back over, and go through the house and turn around and come back home. And she kept doing that until finally Grandma became so tired of it, and she caught a hold of her and set her down, and she said, "Nanny, do you want to lose Jim too? You know, he's lost a little boy too, and he needs you. And if you keep this up, you're going to lose Jim too." And so Mother, for the first time, began to think more of Daddy's grief than of her own. And when she began to try to help him and to do that, then she got well. Crystal had been born on Christmas Day, and Mama didn't get out of bed until Easter Sunday. Well, Tommy was a baby. My folks decided to move west. They came by train to Payette, Idaho, and there they lived for a year or two. They moved to Vail, and there they lost Tommy. And after he was buried, they waited a few years, and then Edna was born. 2 more years than I was born. And now I better tell you some of my early memories. I remember walking with Daddy down a path in the evening and hearing the sounds of early evening. To me, the loneliest sounds and the loneliest time of the day. I remember some child yelling at me and saying, "Good night, sleep tight, don't let the bed bugs bite." I don't know why these little things impressed me, but they did. I remember something about, "What's your name?" and then, "Puddin' tame. Ask me again and I'll tell you the same." I remember enjoying being with Daddy, walking down that path. In fact, I would have been scared to death if he hadn't been with me. Then I can remember being somehow locked in a toilet over behind the house just across the street from where we lived. And I couldn't get out of it because somewhere not too far in front there was a calf tied, and I was scared to death of that calf. And the kids wouldn't come back and let me out because they knew that it was silly to be afraid of the calf. But I screamed so loud that finally I raised some of the folks, and Mama come and got me. I don't know whether Edna got in any trouble for locking me in that barn or not. I can't remember now. But I do know I remember eating mush, sitting in a high chair and eating mush. They must have let me have any amount that I wanted, because I was really stuffed. This next, I'm not sure I remember. I think that I've been told what I said. One time Mama left me with Grandma while she was going somewhere, and I was crying after her because I wanted to go. And Grandma said, "Norma, good little girls don't cry." And I said, "But I'm not a good little girl. I'm a bad little girl. When they gives me bitter medicine, I spits it out." My dad had always worn a mustache, and the only time I ever in my lifetime saw him without that mustache was while we lived in that little house where I was born. I do remember once seeing a man coming into our place like he belonged there, and only his voice let me know it was Daddy. And I didn't like it. I wanted him to get it. His nose looked too big. I do remember the little girl named Frankie something. Frankie Crawford, I believe, who came and played with us sometimes. She was a naughty little girl, and she was quite a little bit older than me. I remember telling Mama that I didn't think that she should come anymore. I said every time she comes, she gets me into meanness, and every time she gets me into it, I does it. I don't have too many memories of that place, but when I was around 5 years old, we moved to our island. What a paradise for children, our island. 80 acres in the middle of Snake River, with the railroad running through the middle of the 80 acres. There were already some buildings on the island, and there was 3 ways that we could get there. We could cross the railroad bridge, we could come by the ferry boat that went with the island, or we could cross at the ford where it was shallow enough for the horses to make their way through. The river had covered the island about 2 years before that, and for some reason it made the soil of the island just like virgin soil. We had lovely sand beaches there in front of our house, and shells, we could pick up shells, and then around the back of the island there were many wild rose bushes and currant bushes, and many sights and things that we had never seen before. You know how one place suddenly becomes home? Well, that one, to me, through all the years of my life, until I was married and had my own home, it was home to me. The Snake was supposed to be a dangerous river, and I suppose it was. In fact, later on I'll tell about when I almost lost my life to it. But we learned to swim. One of the first things I did after I moved to the island was learn to swim. We had gone in down by the ford, and I kept getting in a little deeper water and a little deeper, just paddling around, and all at once I discovered that I was really staying afloat. And from that time on, I wasn't afraid of the water. I'm just going to put in memories as they come to me now. For instance, the time, there was lots of hobos around at that time. I remember that the men were out of work, and it was a bad time. And even some that we knew had gone on the road, as they called it. I remember one morning, the dogs were barking real early, and we got up to look, and there was a man carrying one of our hams across the bridge. And he had come over and got it some way. Daddy had bought those dogs and brought them over there. They were supposed to protect us, but they didn't let us know till it was too late, and the ham was already crossing the bridge. Daddy always had men working for him, and they had a bunkhouse where they all lived. And we had a smokehouse where we kept these hams and things stored. Mother always had a hired girl to help her because it was almost too much work for one woman. I was always so crazy about little chickens. I was almost like an old hen. I even tried to hover some of the chickens, and could make the noises like she did when the hawk came and all of that. And I thought it was so much fun. But for some reason, Daddy had a rooster that was supposed to be a fine rooster, and that rooster hated me. And I remember running from it and feeling like I had to stay in the house and couldn't go places because of that rooster. But one day we had some little ducks that had hatched out, and they had them in a little private pen quite close to the house. And Mama let me go out and stand to watch the ducks. I had looked first, and I saw the rooster way over in the field, and I didn't think he'd pay any attention to me. The first knowledge I had that he was anywhere around, I felt a sharp pain in the back of my leg. and then I could feel his wings beating where he was clinging to me, and I went running around the house screaming at the top of my voice, and Daddy came around the other way, and he had a 2x4 over his shoulder, and he hit that rooster and killed it. Well, all I can say about that rooster is that we tried to eat him, but he was so tough we couldn't even eat the hash. We had an outside toilet, and I remember there was 2 holes there, and one was little that we children were supposed to use, and we weren't supposed to use that big one. But though I was a big coward, there was times when I was venturesome, and I remember one particular day that I thought I'd use that big hole, and I must have been rocking back and forth because all at once I slipped down in it, and my arms were tied up there. There was no way that I could get out. I couldn't even yell because some way I had cut off my ability to yell. I couldn't get my voice out. And so I just hung there, waiting for someone to notice me. I don't know how long it was, but it seemed to me forever, until someone did find me. And then there was the time that we woke up and we became aware that there was a great big snake on our island. It was a python. The circus had gone by and gone slowly through our bridges and gone into town. And for some reason, this snake had gotten away from the circus and was down there. I remember how they talked about how big it was and everything. I didn't actually see it. I probably wouldn't have looked if I could. But I do remember how excited everybody was, and how, too, the circus was so afraid that we'd do something to that animal, and they come searching for him and found him and took him away. Praise the Lord. We were troubled quite a little bit by hobos. I started to tell that first, but they did come and they'd ask for food, and if they would work a little, cut some wood or something, Mom did believe in feeding them. And we would. But they came so often, and they got to where that they didn't even seem to think that they had to work. They just begged. And so Mama wouldn't feed them unless they would work. She wouldn't let them eat. And I remember one particular time, some big burly fellow come and knocked at the door and asked for something to eat, and Mother told him that, asked him if he would work, and he said no. And anyway, she became aware that he was kind of drunk, and she was afraid of him anyway. And so she tried to send him on, and he just reached out his hand and opened the door wider and started in. And we had a little old dog, a little feisty, almost a lap dog. But that little dog knew that man was doing something that he shouldn't. And so it started barking at him and nipping at his heels. And pretty soon that big man went out across the field. I can still see him walking out across our field, our garden and all, and see that little dog. Every time he'd set down a foot, that little dog would nip at the heel. It looked so funny. And then, of course, there was the time when we expected old Pegleg to come off of the nest and with her little chickens. That particular day, Mama had the days all set for when they would hatch. And it was going to be my day because I loved it when the chickens were hatched. But out there instead laid Pegleg's head. There was no eggs and no chicken. And later that day, when the hobos didn't linger after a while, they'd get up and go on. And so we went down into their hobo jungle and looked. And we found where they had tried to cook the eggs, tried to boil them, but they couldn't do anything with them. They had little chickens in them ready to come out. And, of course, we didn't find Pegleg. Pegleg was my chicken. And for some reason, there was 2 little chickens that seemed to have no mother. And Edna had one, and I had one. The only thing is that since they lived in the house with us, our 2 chickens, they weren't supposed to, but they did. And it ran in and out, and somebody shut the door on my little chicken and cut off its foot. And I cried and was in such trouble. And they made a boot and put over that stump, and that chicken walked on that all the days of its life. And she would have chickens and all that, and she was mine, and her little chickens were mine too. I was at my favorite pastime of watching little chickens one day when Grandma Mansker came, and I remember she came out to talk to me. I was sitting on the woodpile watching the chickens. And for the first time, I realized that I had a very pretty grandmother. I'll never forget the willow thickets. I can remember them for both good and bad. They were lots of fun. I remember the folks cut out willows and cut out and cleared a space and made a regular little park down in there. And we had benches and things in there, and we could have picnics and things, and it was a regular little park. And I remember that we kids would cut paths in it and have lots of fun. The only thing was we were always taking out the knives, the butcher knives, and Mama was complaining. And Daddy told us that the next one that took out a butcher knife would get a spanking. Well, I knew that, and I fully intended to see that it got back. But I remember sending Troba, because I was busy, and she went and got the butcher knife for me. And I hacked away at it and had so much fun, and I, of course, forgot to see that the butcher knife got back. And that night, when Daddy came home, Mama told him the butcher knife was gone. And he kind of thought of me, because he asked me, Norma, did you take out the butcher knife? Huh, I was no fool. I knew I was responsible for that butcher knife. But I just couldn't bring myself to say that. And I said, no, Troba did. And how I was so miserable because I knew that I had only deferred what was coming and that it would be worse. And I remember following Daddy with my heart in my throat while he went down and hunted up Troba. And he picked up a little old stick and just kind of switched at her a little bit because I was 6 years older than her. She was a little girl. And Daddy said, why'd you take that butcher knife out? And of course, she said, Tynce told me to. That was me. Tynce was my nickname. And I'll never forget Daddy. That time, I didn't cut my own willow. He did. And as he was coming up the house, I ran back. I went into a room and hid behind the door. But I'll never forget, he came in and placed his hand on the back of a chair that was standing in the middle of the room. And to this day, for some reason, it seems to me like that was the only furniture in there, although I do know better. But he said, Norma, come here. And I went. I knew better than to hold back any longer. And for the first time in my life, I stood and took a switching without trying to hide my legs and crying and screaming. Daddy only switched me 3 times in my life. But I knew that time he was mad at me. I knew he was having difficulty and he was spanking me while he was mad. Because I had not only had told a lie, I had tried to get someone else in trouble. You see, to tell the truth with intent to deceive is a lie. My children can tell you, because I've always taught them that. People used to tell their children such whoppers about where they came from. In my case, they told me they found me in a slough. And when the doctor handed me over to somebody and he told Edna, here, this is yours, Edna. And she always thought I belonged to her, too. I remember making up such a story about Babyland. I used all my imagination on that place. I remember I told them that we put down chairs and walked on the backs of them, and that we had such a wonderful time. And they asked me what I ate, and I said mush. That was always my favorite meal. And they said, well, where did you get it? And I said, well, the mush rats fed me, of course. Once I remember sitting at a big table, and we had lots of company. And they had made ice cream. And there was so much company that Mama took out the whole batch of ice cream and put it on a great big platter so she could fill the freezer again and make another freezer full. But she pushed that platter over in front of me where I sat in my high chair. And she said, here, Norma, that's your dish. And you know, I actually thought that big platter of ice cream was mine. And when they started to dish up to other people, I began to scream. And I tried to put my arms around it, and I kept saying, I likes it too good. Oh, well, I was the baby for 6 years, you know. People said I couldn't walk straight, talk straight, or look straight, and I believe it. Fortunately for me, trouble came along then, and I had to straighten up. It takes quite a bit, though, to take the spoiling out of a young one. There's so many memories of the island that I'm just going to stick them in here and there, and then later try to figure out when they occurred. There's no use in me trying to go along straight on an episode after episode. I'll have to do it that way. I remember the bunkhouse and all the men that was in it. If I remember right, there was 20 teams, so that took a good many men to take care of it all. And take care of the business. I know that there was one boy, I think he was Swede, and they all loved to tease him because he blushed easily. He drove a team, I think it was Duke and Prince, and he decided that he wanted to learn to smoke, and they all rolled their own. So he was learning to do that, and one of the fellows just reached and put in his tobacco sack, put in some manure he picked up there, some light manure he picked up. And the boy, he was rolling his cigarette, and he kept picking out a straw here and there. And he said, well, what's wrong with this tobacco? And the fellow said, oh, it's all right. It's just a little of Duke's mixture. And one fellow told him, he said, you know, I saw a lot of hair and blood up there on the bridge. And he said, I have no brains, and I thought it was you. He said, I'm sure glad to see that you're all right. But he got back on the one that teased him the most. He put Limburger cheese and the sweatband on his hat, and when Lester wore it for a while, believe me, he didn't know where that awful smell was coming from, and we were all kind of glad that the boy got it back on him. There was another gruff kind of a man, but I liked him very much. He always called me Norma May Anderson. Those men sort of seemed like our family. One bright school day morning, Edna and I were just starting out to go to school, and Mama had Daddy get her a gun because she decided that the hobos were dangerous and she ought to have a gun. And she had it stuck in the band of her skirt, and there was a big burly man going across the bridge, and he had some boards off of our ferry boat on his shoulder. And Mama called to him and said, where you going with those boards? And he didn't even look at her. He just spoke over his shoulder and said, what's it to you? And she said, I'll show you what it is to me. And she draws out this gun that wasn't even loaded. But Edna really saved the day, because when she turned and saw the gun, and she began screaming, don't kill him, Mama, don't kill him. And believe me, that man was scared. He turned around and he said, I'll bring him back, lady, I'll bring him back. And he came and he placed him on the bridge, on the boat, and he asked her if there was anything else he could do and everything, but she just told him to go on about his business and to never come there anymore. John Shepherd, one of the boys that worked for us, had been on the road, and he told Mama that there was a sign on the other side of the bridge that said, dangerous woman lives here. No wonder the hobos hadn't been coming so much. Of course, we did learn the signals, when to cross the bridge and when not to. And it was dangerous. I remember a woman and her little girl going by our place, walking along on the railroad track, and evidently they didn't know the signals or they didn't pay any attention, and they tried to walk the big bridge down there. And I remember all the excitement and all the awfulness that they were killed there. Those people that I'd seen walking down there were killed. It was the woman and the little girl. But I'd forgotten she was carrying a baby, and the baby somehow was slung over and was lying flat, and somehow it didn't get killed. Sometimes when a train was switching around up there, you became awfully impatient. You wanted to go. And one time I did try it, and I just got to the pier and had to get down on the pier or I would have been killed. Mother, too, tried that stunt. When Troba and Nora were about, I think, 3 and 5, they decided they'd go swimming one day. And they found overalls, the legs, they had been cut off so somebody could use them, the other part as a bathing suit, I guess. And they pulled these overall legs up over themselves and made suits out of them. And they went swimming. And we missed them, and we began to search for them and call for them. And here they came up. They could hardly walk in those overall legs. But they had been down swimming, and it was just God's mercy that they hadn't been drowned. But there was a little pool there kind of close to the river, and they decided to play in that first. Edna can tell that one so much better than I can. I remember Troba hiding one time. I don't think she meant to hide from us, but when we started calling, she thought it was fun, and so she didn't answer. She wanted to see how long she could stay hid. And on that island, it was really scary. And I remember feeling like, oh, the world had just practically come to an end. And I was hunting for her, and everybody was, and we were calling, and all at once I saw her. She had to peek out to see how we looked or something, I guess, and I caught her at it. And Believe me, she learned that time that when we called, she answered. In those days, it was a good deal different than it is nowadays. When kids wash dishes, they wash some pots and pans and things that were pretty difficult to wash. And we didn't have the helps and everything that you have nowadays. And even the detergent is different now. They had soap, and it wasn't as effective as the detergent. And anyway, I'm making a good excuse for ourselves. But Mother used to make mush in the milk pans sometimes. And Edna and I hid many a one out. We'd stick them under the house, and we had a cupboard that sat outside that had a false front up at the top, and we'd stick them up in there. Every so often, Mom would miss all her pens and wonder where they were, and then she'd come after us and make us dig out all the things that we had hidden. I remember standing and crying and letting the tears drip into my dishpan, but oh, I was glad when all those things were cleaned up again. So even while I was crying there, I was really happy that she had caught us and made us straighten it up. I think I was 9 or 10 when the First World War came along, the war that was going to end all wars. And the kids were, of course, little, but we did have both of them. And anyway, they put soldier boys for a while. They encamped down around the big bridge to guard the bridges, evidently. And it was kind of interesting while the soldier boys were there. But later, when they took them off, they put on bridge guards. And I remember my grandfather was a guard for a while at the big bridge. But one night there was an awful lot of excitement and they were shooting. And the bridge guard said that a man had come along and tried to sneak onto the bridge with a package or something. And that he ran after him and tried to make him come back. And he jumped into the river. And so the guard shot and everything. But you know, we never did see that man. We never did. They never did find him. They dragged the river, but they didn't find him. And everybody always wondered if that guard didn't make it up. And we had a wonderful old German doctor in Ontario, and he brought us all into the world. And believe me, he was dear and sweet, and I believe he was a loyal American. But because they knew that Dr. Prenzing was German, people began to treat him like he was the enemy. And I believe he didn't live very long after that, and I've always kind of thought he died of a broken heart. People are so funny. Someone that's lived among them for years and showed nothing but love and caring for them. And then because he was a German, that's the way they treated him. And we're all from somewhere. The American Indian's the only one that could claim to be an absolute American over here. I think he was just bored and wanted something to happen, because I don't believe anybody really ever tried to destroy our bridges. While the soldiers were there, Edna was old enough that some of them acted like she was pretty cute, but they couldn't see me for sour apples. One evening in July, when I was about 7 years old, the folks were gone somewhere, and just we children and the hired girl was there. And we had the most beautiful sunset. In all my life, I personally have never seen anything like it before or since. It seemed as though the sun was going down in a blaze of fire, and the rays danced on the river and in light and up onto the sand where I stood, as though I was wading in a sea of light. It really frightened me, and I was a very funny little girl, and I really thought the world was coming to an end. And believe me, children know when they're sinners. I knew I was one, and I knew that I had to confess to someone quick. I was so scared. The only one, I was screaming, and Margaret, the hired girl, came running toward me. And I insisted on telling her all my sins, even though she tried to shush me. When it was over, she looked at me, and she said, "Norma, you will tell this all to your mother. If you don't, I will," she said. And then I looked around. The sun had gone down. The chickens were making that funny noise they make just before they go to roost. Everything, it was just a regular evening. And here I had told all. Believe me, I was a very unrepentant sinner. The next morning was the 4th of July, and in our town, we all celebrated it together. We had a huge picnic in the park, and then in the evening we would have fireworks. I had already forgiven myself for all the things that I'd done wrong. They didn't seem bad to me now, and I'd even forgotten it. When here come Margaret, and she said, "Norma, did you tell your mother yet?" And I said no, but I knew I had to go. She saw to it that I went. I went in and was telling Mama about it, and I know she had already told Mother the whole thing because Mama kept prompting me till everything was out. And I was crying and feeling so sorry for myself. And just then my daddy came into the room. And he looked over there at us and he said, "What's the matter with my girl?" And Mama said, "Oh, she's just confessing some of her meanness." And he looked at me so tenderly and sweet and said, "It couldn't have been very bad or my little girl wouldn't have done it." Then I repented. Oh, my heart broke. Here my daddy had trusted me, and I'd been so bad. I don't know. It was the 4th of July, and it was supposed to be a happy day, but it was one of the most miserable of my life. I remember seeing Mama talking to Daddy, and he kind of was looking at me, and I was just sure that that was when she was telling him, and I just felt that I couldn't bear it all. And after the fireworks, I finally crawled into our buggy, and I went to sleep in it. And the next thing I knew was Daddy carrying me into the house. He carried me into my room and laid me down on the bed. And he took the trouble to strip off my long white stockings, my shoes and my long white stockings. And he said, "Go to sleep, honey. You've had a hard day." Oh, somehow forgiveness. How wonderful it all was to me. How lovely was my room. How precious to know that he still loved me after all my sin. I had always been very impressionable about the things I heard from the Bible. I often went and stayed with my grandparents, and they always had family worship. And I'd hear such scriptures as the earth shall melt with fervent heat and all that. And one evening I was watching Daddy. He was burning weeds, and we had tumbleweeds, and he was burning these weeds. And I got to thinking about the earth melting with fervent heat. And then I thought, that's an awful big fire Daddy's building. And all at once I began to jump up and down and scream and said, "Daddy, you're burning the world up." He told me later that he really didn't know what to do with me. He could tell from the way I was acting that I really believed that he was burning the world up. So he did really the best thing that he could. He spanked me and told me to now get a hold of myself, that he wasn't doing anything of the kind. One time there was a big camp meeting, a big tent. I remember that it was just a block or two away from the schoolhouse where it was spread out. And one day they announced in school that after school there was going to be a special children's meeting. I went, and I don't know who the preacher was, but oh, he sure convinced me that the Lord loved me and that he would forgive me and that I could be his child. And what impressed me was that he would be sticking closer than a brother, that he was right there whenever I needed him. And I had always been such a big coward, and I was a very skinny child. I remember when I'd lie down at night, I felt like my stomach was going to go through my backbone if I laid on my back. And that night when I went home, we had to cross the bridge and then run down the railroad grading. And I remember running down that grading and feeling just like I could fly. And I did feel the Lord near me, and I believe he did save me at that time. I remember that I know for some reason it seemed to even help me where my stomach was concerned. I didn't feel like it was going to sink through my backbone. And neither was I afraid of everything in the room after the lights was out. We had 2 glass doors. They were in different rooms, but there was just a small partition that you ran around to get from one to the other. And I remember one night having a dream, and it seemed like a window opened up in heaven. To me, I was awake, and I looked out at one of those windows, that square window, and there was a square window opened up in heaven, and against the dark sky, and there were people eating up in there, and the one with his back turned to me seemed to be the important person in it. But it was such a a happy-looking group up there, and finally they brought in one person, clothed in dark garments, not dressed like the rest, and they cast that one out and cast him down. And it seemed like that beneath that in that dark sky there opened up a square even darker than the sky. And then from that upstairs part, an angel came down and went around our house. And then I heard things in the kitchen. I don't remember waking up, but I suppose that I did. But that was the night that my Aunt Ida died. Remember, Aunt Ida was the one that was saved in the child's meeting when Mama preached? And I always knew that what a sweet and wonderful person she was. She was Mama's youngest sister. Her little boy was only 3 years old, and he came to stay with us for a while after Aunt Ida died, until Uncle Brooks took him to California, and we didn't ever see him again. Finally, that great war ended, the one that was supposed to end all wars. And oh, did the town ever celebrate that night when we heard the 11th of November, and we really celebrated in our town. Of course, I almost got my brains knocked out because I was too careless around the big campfire that they had built, and someone with a 2x4 walked by and somehow managed to hit me in the back of the head. And so I didn't really get to celebrate it too much. But then the flu came. Oh, there was tales about the flu. Hardly anyone in our town that didn't lose somebody to the flu. More were lost to the flu than was lost to the war. I remember that we had Dr. Pogue. He was an old-fashioned doctor, and he treated us in a different way than most of the newer doctors did in town. But he's the only one in town that didn't lose a patient. Mama and Nora and Troba and I all had the flu. Edna and Daddy took care of us all. I remember that I probably was the sickest I ever was until much later in life. I remember that everything in the room seemed to dance around and point at me, and it seemed like there was somebody or something pointing at me around the door all the time. Mama had pneumonia with that flu, and yet he pulled us all through, that doctor did, and he treated it like old-fashioned grip, so he told us. I left out a story that I should tell, perhaps, that happened when I was quite a bit younger. I was 5 or 6, when we had a horse that was balky. He never would do what was told to him. And once we were crossing on the ferry boat, and we always had to get out of the buggy and stand. Daddy wouldn't let us stay in the buggy when we were crossing the river. And I was kind of back towards the back of the boat. And when Dad tried to lead that horse forward, we landed on the side by the island, that horse wouldn't do it. It started backing up, and the wheel started twisting, and it kept coming closer and closer to me. And everybody was screaming, and there was just nothing to do, only self-preservation. I just turned and climbed up the side of the boat and over on the other side of it. And the horse went on and backed into the river. I guess it just wasn't my time to go. But that horse backed, buggy and all, and himself off into the river. And then it broke the buggy all up, and it was just the shafts came up by the horse yet when he went down by the ford and began to come out of the river. And Daddy went and got him, and I had never seen my Daddy in such a shape. He brought that horse up again and again and backed him into the river and made him swim out again. And he kept hitting him over the head with a willow. My Daddy had told me, well, he told me later, that he had always had a terrible temper, but that he had learned to control it because he knew that if he didn't control his temper, it would control him. And that's the only real time I ever saw when I could tell what it would do. He was sick in bed for 3 days after that. Our beach and our side of the river between us and the town was the swimming hole for the whole town. Everyone came to swim there. I can remember summer evenings when the banks were just dotted with people up there watching the swimmers and the divers, and how much fun it all was, how we just practically lived in the river. how proud I was when my little 4-year-old sister Nora took her turn on the big diving board diving. They all could dive and swim. I could swim too, but I was not a diver. For some reason, when I got down low in the river, I felt like I wasn't coming up, and somehow I just couldn't bring myself to dive. One bright late spring day, 3 of the town girls had come out to play with us. Our island was really a place that all the children, I think, envied us. It was just a natural playground. Thelma, Adrian, and Evelyn Hagee were the girls, and we'd had a lovely time. The river was in flood tide, as it did sometimes in the spring. I suppose snows had melted somewhere, and the river was really kind of rampant. It had covered the sandbars and was halfway up the steps that led up to our front yard. When it came time for the girls to go back home, we were going to walk a ways with them, but our clothes were wet, and so I decided to change. And besides, I wanted to show off. Mama had bought me a corset. A 10-year-old with a corset, can you imagine that? But I guess in Mama's day, they had worn things like that to cause them to have a small waist, and I guess I really needed one. But anyway, we stopped at the strawberry patch and ate a few strawberries, and I got stains on my hands. And when we got out to the railroad grading, there was a freight train going through the ridges, and so we had to wait. And Thelma and I thought we'd go down and wash, no, it was Evelyn and I thought we'd go down and wash our hands, the strawberry stains off. I had even put on my hat and my shoes. And anyway, when I leaned over at the pumping plant to wash my hands, that corset pushed me in the river. I had landed in a sort of a whirlpool, and it was taking me back upstream instead of down and over between the currents. I remember seeing my friend Evelyn jumping up and down on the bank there, and I could still see Edna and Thelma counting the railroad cars as they'd gone by. And the next thing I remember, I kept whirling around, and I saw Edna and Thelma standing on the bank, and Thelma started to jump in, and Edna reached out and grabbed her and threw her down in the mud. And then the next thing I knew, Edna was there. And I was so glad to see her, I just threw my arms around her neck and took us both under. When we came up, she said, "Norma, let go your hat." And I let go of my hat, and I thought Mama will whip me for that when I saw it going down the river. And then Edna started taking me out of there. It must have been awfully hard, because I was either knocked out or something, because I didn't realize exactly what I was doing. To me, it still seems like sort of a dream. Finally, Edna said to me, "Norma, I'm not going to make it turn loose of me." And I did turn loose of her, because I loved her. I had no desire to hurt her, and I turned loose of her, but I didn't think I was coming up, and I could feel her beside me. And I reached up, and I guess I caught a hold of her hair that was floating down around her, and I pulled myself up. And she said that when I did that she touched her feet to ground, and it came just to her eyes, she could look out and see that she was getting to where she could wade out. And she did, but I caught onto a willow that was submerged and was still clinging there. And someone had managed to rouse Mother. She was dressing for town, and she had come. They said she jumped that fence, and she had come in at the boat landing and came upstream and held me up out of my head out of the water until the bridge guard could get over there. He couldn't come before because the train was on the bridge, and he came over and helped Mama and I out. And Edna was lying there on the bank, and she was just having such a time getting her breath, gasping for breath, and I was able to stand and look down at her. Therefore, I know she'd done all the work. When we were walking to the house, Mother looked down, and her track was filled with blood. And she said to me, "Norma, let's see what you did." How useless I felt. And then when we got to the house, she didn't even know why it was filled with blood. I don't know. And she didn't realize she wasn't dressed. She just had on some sort of an undergarment. And someone was examining her foot there, and she happened to look down at herself, and she yelled, and then we put something around her. And I remember that I peeled out of that corset, and oh, I hated it. And I never have worn one, ever. We found that Mama had stepped on some kind of a plowshare that was buried there in the riverbed, and had cut her little toe so that it would lead back over her foot. Well, the doctor stopped the bleeding because it was an artery that was bleeding, and he sewed that toe back on, and Mama kept her little toe. The wind came up a little bit that night, and when our groceries were delivered, they'd only bring them to the far bank over there, and we had to go across and get them. So the hired girl and I went across to get them that night, and the wind had put the river into little white caps, and I remember how lonely and funny looking the river looked to me. And that girl pointed to it and said, "Norma, if it wasn't for Edna, you'd be under there tonight." I've often wondered, did they think that I didn't care? It did something to me. I always wondered if maybe Edna hadn't wasted her time. I remember one of Edna's girlfriends. If I didn't just exactly please them, she'd say to me, "Edna should have let you drown." And Edna would say, "Yes, I should." But she told me that she always under her breath said, "No, I shouldn't," because she's afraid the Lord would be listening. Let me hasten to say I knew she loved me, and she'd sure proved it when she came in there and got me. I'm not trying to knock down on my sister. When the paper came out in town telling about us, we had quite a laugh out of it, because it said, "Mrs. Doty coming in at the boat landing dragged both daughters to the show." The winter after we had the flu, or the winter while we had the flu, was an awful cold winter, and the ice formed in the river awful thick. And finally, we had what we called an ice jam under the bridge, and those huge cakes of ice just kept piling up under the bridge until they were afraid that it was going to take the bridge out. And I remember that they made all of us leave the island one night because they were so sure that it was going to something was going to happen, and they didn't know what would how it would affect everything, or whether the island would be flooded. And we all left but Daddy and Edna again. She was quite a gal. But anyway, we were at Aunt Bertha's, and about 3 o'clock in the morning, they come over and said that they'd made them get up. And then the next morning, we walked home on the ice, because it had all gone out in the night, and it just left a thick ice for us to walk home on. Goodness knows I wasn't great for work as a kid. Remember the milk pans that we had under the house? But one time, we got to talking about, or we read about brownies, and so Edna and I decided that we'd be brownies, that we'd get up and do a lot of work in the morning, and before the folks got up, and they'd think it was brownies. We were really going great, and then I was going to set the table, and instead of taking a few plates at a time, I took the whole stack and started towards the table. It was too much for me, and I tripped and I dropped that whole stack of plates, and they shattered at my feet. In about 2 seconds, Mama was there and looking down at those plates. I don't remember whether she punished me or not. I know that it was punishment enough to be caught like that. Another time, I figured out how we could get out of a lot of work by just going around and washing each plate and everything at the table and leaving it set for supper. Well, we did that. How come Edna fell in with my scheme, I don't know. But anyway, I went around with the dish rag, and she came with the towel, and we did all of them and left it set on the table that way, all ready for supper. Then we went out to play. I remember we were playing in the cornfield, and the corn was higher than us, but Mama called, and she said, "Get in here and wash the dishes." She was pretty mad at us for doing that. And I said, "Oh, they're washed. They're washed and the table's set." And she said, "They're not clean." So we not only had the labor of doing what we had done before, but we had to go back and take them all in and wash them right. Then Daddy had me weeding onions, and for every row that I weeded, he gave me 5 cents. I weeded enough rows of onions that I got $1, and then I quit. I took my $1 to town, and I went into the variety store and looked around, and I found some little dolls for 10 cents apiece, and I bought 10 of them, all alike. That was the extent of my labor that time. And then I remember that I've always heard about me sweeping and not knowing where to put the dirt and lifting up the rug and sweeping it under it. I don't remember that, but I'm sure I did it. I rather like to wash dishes now, but when I was a child it was pure pain. I remember Daddy then offered 5 cents a tail for any gopher that we could get. So we took our traps and we went out and we'd find a gopher hole and set our traps. But then when we caught the gopher, then we had to knock him in the head and cut off his tail. And that proved too much for me. I didn't care about that way of making money. But when I was big enough, I was required to go out in the hayfield after it was mowed and raked, and then we went out and made it into shocks. And I used to do that, and I rather enjoyed that. I always felt like I was doing something so big, and that made a difference. My one attempt at driving Derek, though, turned into a miserable failure, and I just turned and walked home, and Daddy didn't even try to call me back. One time I was coming from the barn with my 2 little sisters, and down the road facing us came the cows coming home to be milked. Oh, I know that they were just old moo cows, but they were a terror to me. I was scared to death of them. They had horns, and I could have been over the fence there beside me and gone. But that would have left my little sisters. And so I put my little sisters behind me and I began to scream. One old cow, the lead cow, I think I scared her because she put her head down and began to swing it back and forth. And I was just sure that it was my end, but I still wouldn't leave my little sisters. So you see, I had my own brand of courage, although it was pretty silly. Also, I knew that I wasn't allowed to spank or hit the little girls. I loved them, and there was very little reason for me to do such a thing. But I remember one time on our way to school that Troba was disputing me about something. And I looked at her, and she had her cheek kind of turned to me, and some way she looked so sassy to me. And I just couldn't resist, so I decided to hit her. And I turned to slap her, and just as I did, she turned her head, and I hit her in the nose. And it bled all over everything. And I was scared to death because I knew what my fate would be. I took her to Aunt Bertha's and was trying to clean her up and trying to explain everything, and still scared to death. And I knew we'd be late for school, but just then someone came and said, "There's no school today. Something happened to the registers, and there was just no school today." And so we had to go home and face it even sooner. I know I loved my little sisters, and I know that they loved me, but they also knew me, worse luck. One nice spring day, I remember a bunch of girls came out, and we decided that we'd go swimming down by the big river. That was the one that went back of our place. It was a warm day, but the water was very cold. As it would happen, there was a sort of a place where the water ran in, so we didn't go into the river where the current was, but we did go in there, and it was deep. And I remember we took off all our clothes but some underwear and went in, and we were having a good time, although we were nearly freezing to death, when we happened to look up, and there stood the bridge guard watching us. We'd forgotten about him, and the bridge guard at that time happened to be Grandpa Mansker, so we knew that we'd hear about it, that he'd tell them, and we'd be punished pretty bad for that. But we consoled ourselves. We went home saying, "A licking don't last long, a scolding don't hurt, and killing's forbidden, so why should we worry?" Grandpa became bored with that job and quit because nothing happened. They just sat there all day and waited for somebody that didn't ever come. And so bridge guards changed quite often. And there was an old fellow that bought eggs and things from us. And one day, Mama sent Edna down with some things that he always got from us. And that old fellow took her into the little place that they had built for them and locked the door. And then he tried to get a little funny with her. She fought him, and he told her, now you mustn't tell this. If you tell it, your folks will be awful mad and they'll really whip you. And then he finally let Edna go. And she ran home, and the first thing she did was tell all about it. Daddy was for going down and doing something right then. But Mama said, no, that won't be enough. She said, you wait. I intend to see that he leaves the country. The man waited 3 days before he decided that everything was safe and he better come and get some water or whatever it was that he got at our place then. And Mama let him climb through the fence and get almost to the house. And then she opened the door, and she still had that gun, and she trained it on him, and she let him know what she thought of him. And she said, and if you know what's good for you, you better get out of this town. And do you know, he did? I must not have been a very attractive little girl. Nobody ever tried such funny things with me. Praise the Lord. One recess, my friends and I were walking along down the sidewalk, and they're sitting on the bank of a ditch where my little sister Troba and some of the kid from her class. And one girl was saying some pretty mean things to her. I remember her telling Troba her face was dirty and this and that. And for some reason, I couldn't take that. I left my friends and went over and sat down, and I remember saying to her, well, Troba, don't worry. You can wash your face, and you'll be a pretty little girl again. But poor Wilma, she has to look like that the rest of her life. I suppose I should have been ashamed of myself, but at the time I only felt good. My folks were young enough to be fun. I remember when we first moved down to the island, for several years. Sometimes we'd decide that we was going to camp out the next day. And so we'd build a campfire out in the yard and have our meal cooked over a campfire. It was there that Daddy taught me to be modest. I remember sitting by the fire with my legs crossed and my skirts kind of fell down around my hips. And Daddy looked at me and kind of frowned and shook his head and said, you're a big girl now. And believe me, from then on, I was a modest child. I don't know how Daddy did it, but he sure ingrained in us the desire to please him. And mostly it was done by love. Some of the things I learned to hate as a child helped me when I grew up. I saw to it that I didn't do that. I remember when I was a kid, maybe it was because Mama had so many people to cook for and so much to do, but fruit jars were put away dirty. I never did that, but I had a little hand, and when it come time to wash the fruit jars, often I had to stand and stick my hand down in because my hand would go into a mason jar and wash out all that junk. I hated it. Then we'd boil the jars and they'd be thoroughly clean before they were used again. Just a little ways from our house was another house. It was just one room, but it was well built, and there was a shed on the back of it. That, in the winter, was a bedroom and a walk-in clothes closet. But in the summer, it became a summer kitchen and dining room. We were always changing things like that. People don't do those things nowadays, and a lot of the fun is lost. I remember, too, that sometimes the kitchen and dining room was in the basement when we moved to another place. And then again, it was upstairs. She always had a nice-looking kitchen upstairs that we didn't use, but downstairs was our family kitchen and dining room. Clayton's mother did the same sort of thing. I remember she had her kitchen moved out on the porch one time. I think most children are curious. I remember when Mama brought home True Confessions magazines, and she troubled us and told us that we must not read them. Above all, those were taboo. We shouldn't read them. Well, I was determined after that, and I sneaked around and finally read them. And then finally, they were too much for me. I didn't care for them. They hadn't touched my life, and I didn't like that. The way to have kept them really out of my hands was not to get them herself. I'll never forget seeing a bunch of boys in swimming, and I loved the river and loved to swim, and it was always exciting to me to watch swimmers and watch divers. And so I went down, although I was the only little girl down there. And the boys were just a little bit older than me. Well, I didn't go where they were. I stayed over on my own side and kind of swam around the shallows, but I was laughing at what they did and enjoying it quite a bit. And all at once, someone came up under me and grabbed me where they shouldn't. And oh, I came up out of that water. I was so mad I was going to personally kill whoever did it. And then I looked at them, and I knew by their eyes that they all knew it, that it had been something that they had made up between them. And therefore, I went to the house, and after that I was bright enough not to do that. I remember seeing a man run down real quick and go under the bridge, and I thought, what in the world is he after? And so I ran to look and see what he was after. And there he was, relieving himself. And he turned and grinned at me over his shoulder. Ah, by these things we learn. How I loved the long, warm days of summer. I went without shoes all summer long. And then when fall came and I had to go to school and had to put on my shoes, ooh, how they pinched. But I was always glad when school started. It seemed like here was something different, and it was fun to go. It was fun when it quit, but it was fun to go, too. And then there was the winter months, when it was so freezing cold, and we walked that bridge, and it was a dangerous thing, unless we were very, very careful. I remember when they had to put in a new span there, build a new bridge there, and they put up what they called a cofferdam. Well, Mama thought that there was something funny in that, and she had such a cold. And I remember she drilled Troba on it. And so finally, Mama said, excuse me for stammering. And then one day, Troba did what Mama told her to, and she told Daddy, you know, Daddy, I wish Mama would cofferdam head off. Wasn't that something to teach a little girl when they weren't even allowed to use slang? But Mama was quite a gal. She liked to do things like that. I remember one time she was telling us that we were descendants from Zeb Stewart because Mama's mother had been a Stewart before she was married. And she was tracing these relationships back and telling us that we were related to them. I didn't really much believe that. I thought she was just kidding us. But Daddy, he came along, and he kind of was talking to, and he said, well, did I ever tell you about your Uncle Booker T? He said, Booker T. Washington said, he's my uncle. And I believed it. I believed anything Daddy told me. And I went to school, and I remember bragging and telling the teacher that Booker T. Washington was my uncle. And I remember how she looked at me. And I went home, and so I said to Daddy, what's wrong with Uncle Booker T? And he said, well, nothing, only he's colored. I remember when I was the third grader that a little Indian boy came to school, and he was a handsome little fellow. I remember his teeth when he smiled, how pretty he looked. And I was so in love with him, and so were nearly all the girls in my grade. But most of the girls were prettier and bolder than me, and so there was really little hope for me. In the fourth grade one day, the teacher said that I was the best speller in the room. Well, there was a lot of kids that quarreled with that, including me. I really knew better, and they all said that Ruth Preston was. So she had a spelling bee, and she put Ruth was one captain and I was the other. And we chose up sides, and the second word that she gave me, I went down on. See how I let my teacher down? The word was bureau. And what she didn't know was that I spelled words exactly like they sounded to me. So I said B-U-R-O-W. And so she looked so disappointed in me, and I felt so sorry about it. But believe me, I know how to spell bureau, and I never forgot it again. B-U-R-E-A-U. So of course to Ruth went all the glory. In fifth grade, we learned the states and their capitals. And I did have a good memory, and I did learn them. I was letter perfect in it. They couldn't put me down. So she took our grade into the sixth grade to see, and we had to spell down in the states and their capitals. What I mean is that she'd give the state and we'd say the capital, or she'd say the capital and we'd say the state. I was finally put everyone down, and I was the last one standing there. But that was too much for me. I couldn't stand to stand there in front of everybody, and she decided she was going to show them that I couldn't be put down. And so I went down on the very next one she gave me. Too bad she didn't know me well enough to know that I couldn't do that. I know what a horrible picture I'm painting of myself, but this is a truthful thing I'm doing. I want you to know what I'm like. I was cowardly, very timid, and that's me. Too curious, not overly obedient. Gloria thought I should tell what the cofferdam was. It was a structure built in the river right beside the bridge that somehow braced the bridge while they took out old ties and things and replaced them with new. Thus the whole span was replaced bit by bit without interrupting the work of the railroad. I still remember how much fun it was to come home from school and have the workmen take me down around the sidewalk they had built in the cofferdam around to the other part of the bridge so that I could go on home. I should say, too, that when Mama was teaching Troba about the cofferdam, first Troba asked Daddy, is it wrong to say cofferdam? And he said, oh, no, of course it isn't. And then she said she wished Mom would cut her damn head off. I've heard Daddy tell it and laughs to people and laughed so hard and never realized that it was just something Mama had taught Troba. Then I began to grow up a little. First I noticed that boys paid a little bit of attention to me, and that was new to me. I remember one time my girlfriend and I were out playing around the bridges, and a couple of boys come, and we decided to walk down toward the big bridge. And Mama didn't allow that, but I never thought too much about it. I did think the other girl had the cutest boyfriend. But when we had started back, when here come Mother down the track, and she had a switch, embarrassed me half to death. And she informed me that I was not to play around the big bridge, that I didn't go down there with boys. And she informed me that I must come home right now. Well, I intended to walk back with all of them when they started walking back. But when Mama turned around, I saw a spot on the back of her dress. And that troubled me so that I started right out walking behind her, trying to shield her so nobody would see it. But I remember I was storming at her and telling her that I never could have any friends, that she embarrassed me and this and that and the other thing. Didn't realize that in about 2 weeks I wouldn't have looked at either of those boys. Then I became aware that I had a sort of power, that people were trying to impress me, those boys were, instead of me having to impress people. And like every girl that ever lived, I guess, I began to try to see just what I could do. I remember looking into someone's eyes and seeing that troubled them, that they didn't hardly know what to do. My too steady gaze, I guess. And then, too, I'd see them roam and look me over. It was rather surprising because I thought I'd never develop, never look like a grown-up woman. I was terribly slow, too. Then Edna had a boyfriend, Ralph Keel. And oh my, what things were going on. Edna was careful how she dressed and everything. And then, not to be outdone, I began to think that I needed a boyfriend too. Not a steady one. I didn't want a steady one. Then I heard that Ralph was bringing his little brother over for a date for me. And I was scared half to death because I'd heard so much about them and what cute boys they were and everything that I knew I had to be very careful. And besides that, they dressed me up in Edna's clothes, and they didn't fit me. They pinned them on me and everything, and at the last minute I discovered that the rubber in the top of my bloomers had broken. I didn't know what else to do, so I got a big safety pin and I kind of wadded them up around me and pinned them. And then when they came, we went for a walk. I didn't only have on one of Edna's dresses, I had on two. Of course, the top one was lace, and the other one kind of showed through and made it look kind of pretty, so I guess I was presentable. But we went down to the big bridge, and we got out on the pier. And I began to feel a little easier and began to be able to talk and was having a pretty good time. And then, but it came time for us to go back towards the house. And so just as I was climbing up off of the pier, that pin came open. And I knew that they were just apt to come off in front of everybody. So I insisted on them going back and leaving me for something. And they did. And I pinned it carefully. And then I started back up onto the bridge again. And sure enough, while I was climbing, it came open again. And I wearily climbed back down. Lee had started back towards me, but this time, the last time when I climbed up on the bridge, he let me come alone. Years later at a dance, he asked me, he said, what was wrong? He said, I know there had to be something. And I said, well, to tell you the truth, my strap broke. I didn't dare tell him that it was my bloomers. He said, I thought it was something like that. I remember when I was a little girl, I always hated it when they told Daddy to wash me. He was pretty thorough, but he never used a wash rag. And I remember him running his hands up and down my arms, and it never seemed to me he allowed room for my elbow. There was some kind of trouble between Mom and Dad for a while. I remember Mama went to Boise and she took Nora with her. I was just at the stage in my growth where I thought, I'm soon going to be a young woman. I remember going and standing and looking in the mirror and saying, young womanhood without a mother. Oh, I was a dramatic child. Daddy always hired men. I remember he had one. I couldn't have been more than 11 years old when he hired Jack Pleasant. And for some reason, Jack thought he fell in love with me. Although he was 25 and I was the skinniest kid alive. I remember him climbing to the very top of a peach tree to get me one nice ripe peach that was up there. As you might know, there was something wrong with Jack. He was a little bit cuckoo, I guess, thinking he fell in love with an 11-year-old. After he left, I remember that he wrote me a silly little thing, and it said something about, when you get married and live over the hill, I'll send you a kiss by whippoorwill. There was something about Daddy's hard men. They nearly always fell in love with one of us. The only ones that did with me was Jack and then Jerry. Funny, I can't even remember Jerry's last name now, but I do know that they said that he had two hearts, or his heart was on the right side instead of the left. That's probably what it was. I can't remember for sure. But he, too, thought that he liked me. And I did try out my wilds on him as I was growing up, because it was nice and safe. He was a nice boy, and it was kind of easy to try out my wilds on him. I didn't really mean any of them. But one time, I went to the post office, and I got a thing written to me with no name signed. But it was a beautiful verse that he'd copied it out of something. But I remember that it was, if you were a rose and I a bee in the world a garden of jasmine sweet, I'd kiss but you and drink the dew on the warm red petals of you, just you. If you were the moon and I the sun, and I'd never ride o'er the earth again, but up in the sky with no one nigh, we'd live and dream, you and I, you and I. But you're not a rose, or the moon you see, and I'm not the sun or a bumblebee. You're just a lass, but as sweet and true as the rarest flower that God e'er grew. And I love you because you're you. While I was reading that to my girlfriend and we were laughing and having a big time, Jerry came in. And he looked at it and laughed too, and we had a big time over it. And years later, Mama told me, do you know who sent that poem to you? It was Jerry, she said. He showed it to me and told me he was going to send it to you. And there I'd made all sorts of fun of it. Like all kids, we used to fight some, mostly when the folks weren't around. I know that I loved my sisters and loved them very much, but I could get aggravated at them and everything. I remember once Edna pushed me. I don't know what for, but I kind of fell back against the colonnade. And when I did, I reached up and felt a brush on it. And she went running out the door, and I couldn't catch her, so I threw that brush after her. And it hit her in the temple. And she just fell flat and was knocked out. And I went and She said that when she came to, the first thing she heard was me saying, "Speak to me, please speak to me." I remember fighting with Troba over the cream on the top of the milk. It seemed to me like I would taste something, but it didn't seem so bad for me to take a taste of it and not do anything about it. But Troba was doing it, and I didn't want her to. But you know something? Even though I was 6 years older, that gal knew how to fight. She had long nails, and she could somehow stick her arms out there, and she could almost best me. And I remember Nora, she said I was stingy. I shouldn't tell this probably, but I remember we had a cow that had a calf, and she would sometimes reach back and manage to nurse herself. And I remember that Nora told me, said that Norma's stingy. If she was a cow and had a calf, she'd duck herself. That sounds terrible. Don't put that in your story. I'm just letting you know what a stinker I was. I think I learned to love the funnies because I associated them with nice things. Daddy used to bring the paper in and give us kids the funnies, and while he was reading it, he usually had brought us some candy, and we were eating candy and looking at the funnies. And he did smoke, and he nearly always had that cigar. And somehow, the smell of cigar smoke has always kind of made me feel good, but not for long. I told about a certain power I began to feel over the opposite sex. Well, really and truly, that was deceiving, because I was so shy that unless I knew them real well, I could hardly speak at all. I remember some very bad moments when I couldn't even open my mouth, and somebody had asked me something. That's what you call painfully shy. I suddenly remembered Jerry's last name. It was Donovan. Mama came home from Boise, but she never seemed to be too happy a woman after that. However, we had habits in our family that were very good. I remember we used to read to one another. Usually it was Daddy or me. I loved to hear Daddy read. His voice would get so tense sometimes when he was reading a special tense piece of writing, and I could hardly wait to hear the end of the story. In fact, I never did wait. I always hunted up the book and found out what happened. It didn't take away from the reading aloud to one another when night came on. I still enjoyed it intensely. Television has done an awful lot to ruin family living. I was indeed a bookworm. I loved English. I remember getting to where I thought I was really good in it. I thought that I was probably as good as any she had in the room, if not the best. Then one day she sent a note home to my parents, and I decided that I'd read it. She was my English teacher. My arithmetic teacher was somebody else. But in this note she said I was failing in arithmetic and grammar. That's English, you know. But anyway, I knew that that wasn't true. And I went to her, and I told her that the note she sent home to my parents, that I'd just as well quit school if I was failing in grammar. Because I said, I'm good in it. I'm about the best you have in the room. She took the note and said, well, Norma, I'll notice. I'll pay particular attention. And she tore it up then. And, about a week later, I hadn't even done as good because I was so discouraged. I thought you can just try your heart out and they don't even notice. And anyway, she came to me and she said, well, Norma, you've improved a lot. You know, I never could respect her for that. If she had told me that she had been mistaken, I would have. But not when she came and told me I'd improved when I really hadn't. It was true, I found math hard. I learned my times tables to the extent that I knew my 5s, and of course 2s and 3s. And I could say them and figure them fast enough that the teacher never did know that I didn't learn the rest. That took more work than it would have taken to learn the times table. It was strange, but the teachers that the other kids called the old lady so-and-so, like the old lady Platt and the old lady Smith, those were my favorite teachers because they were fair. They never gave me any credit that I didn't deserve, and they didn't knock down on me if I did deserve it. I'm sure that all was the matter with the other kids was that the teacher was determined and strict. In other words, good teachers. The teacher that I thought was so very unjust raised pretty high in the school. She was the grade school principal. I remember her husband was, we bigger girls when I was in the 8th grade, we knew to be careful around him because he was always trying to touch us some way. And then I remember we had state examinations, and he would come around and see how we were doing, and if we were having trouble with an answer, he'd tell us. He should never have been allowed in the school system at all. I know Mother was terribly unhappy along about the time that I was ready to get out of the grade school, and I remember that she used to tell me morning after morning, I won't be here when you come back. And I always thought she meant she'd die, and I'd spend the whole day trying to forget what Mom had said in the morning. And then when I'd come home at night, as I stayed in town as long as I could, but when I began to near the bridge and know I was going home, I'd start to really hold my breath and feel terrible. And the moment I stepped inside the door and saw Mama still standing there, then I began to live again. I don't believe she meant to hurt us, but for some reason, she was unhappy and she couldn't keep from voicing it. Maybe she really thought she would die. Maybe she thought she'd do something to herself. I don't really know, but she really put us all through something. Needless to say, I wasn't doing anything very good in school. It seemed needless to try. I had my mind on other things. And too, it might have been my own laziness. I don't want to blame other people for my lack of studying. I've always said I only went through the 8th grade because actually I did. I know that all the time that I spent in high school wasn't worth it. I didn't do anything, really. While Mama was in Boise, my dad had the contract to pave the streets in Ontario. It was quite a big job, and I personally was awfully proud of that. I remember sitting with a girl in our car when we still had the Coal 8, and I was bragging to her about my daddy being such a big man. He was going to do all this. And just then, 2 men come out of the bank and started walking down towards us. And one was Daddy and one was the banker. And I said, "Oh, there's Daddy now." And the girl said, "Which one?" And just then I looked at Daddy, and Daddy was in his work clothes. And he didn't look at all dressed up and nice like the banker did. And so I said, "Oh, the one that looks like a tramp." You know, I told Daddy that, and it just tickled him half to death. So much happened along about then. I remember that my cousin Tom, he was just a year or 2 older than Edna, and they came out from Oklahoma, and he had such a case on Edna. She was an awful cute thing, and he could hardly stand it. He had such a case on her. He also worked for Daddy, and one time he knew that we had a horse, that you had to be careful around the backside of him because he would kick. He was like a goosey person. And Tom deliberately slapped him across the rump with the board, and the horse kicked his eyes out. It was such a sad thing, such a young man. It seemed whatever could go wrong did go wrong that year. The river broke in on Daddy's gravel beds, and he had trouble getting the gravel out. He also paid for Tom's accident, even though Tom admitted that he did it himself and that he knew better. Daddy did, of course, pay for all the care that he got in the hospital and everything. Needless to say, Daddy went bottoms up on that contract. My sister Edna even had to have an operation. She had her appendix out. And in those days, it wasn't as simple an operation as we think it is sometimes now, because we didn't have penicillin or anything that would keep you from dying. I remember her being home and looking so white and so funny, but she would get up and go outside to the toilet instead of letting us help her, and she had to go back to the hospital. I remember that she was sitting out there on the toilet, and that the hired man had to go and carry her in. And then, of course, she was rushed to the hospital, and I don't remember now just what happened, but she could tell you about that.
We'll start with Grandma.
Well, he was born. My husband was born with one leg, his right leg, 6 inches shorter than the other. And it took him quite a while to learn to walk because of that leg. And he ran away once when he was little, just crawling. And he went down through some fences even and was down by the creek. And Mother Anderson went after him. And when she saw him, there was a big rattlesnake not far from where he was. And she reached and got her baby, and the rattlesnake bit her on her little finger. And she wrapped something around her, but first she killed the rattler. She wrapped something around her arm, but then she killed the rattler.
How'd she kill it?
I don't know how, but she killed the rattler. And then she brought him back, and they killed a chicken, and they ripped it open, and she stuck her hand in there to try to draw out the poison. And
it turned blue. I remember they said it turned green-blue.
And then after a while,
it's flesh.
She had good teeth then, and she sucked at that to try to get any poison that remained. And anyway, she did recover. And Clayton, before his second year sometime, Clayton did learn to walk. He just toddled along. He was a determined baby, and he did just what other babies did. And as he grew older, when it became time for them to go to school, there was 3 boys. The first 3 children were boys. Clayton was the oldest of 10 children. One died in infancy, so there was 9 children that were raised completely, and he was the oldest. And there was no more children with any marks like Clayton had. But nevertheless, the first 2 years in school, his mother was his teacher. They gave her a license to teach and paid her to teach them, but she taught her first 3 children herself at home. They were the ones that were the age to go to school. And then when they moved to town, Clayton and Earl were both put in the 3rd grade and Frank in the 2nd. There was only 11 months difference between Clayton and Earl. Oh, and anyway, Clayton was challenged to fight sometimes. I don't know why kids would pick on them. I guess they thought he'd be an easy mark. And he tried to avoid fighting. He wasn't the one that loved fighting. But one time, some bully in the class was picking on a smaller boy, and for some reason Clayton couldn't take that, and so he'd come and challenged him, said, "Pick on me," and they had a big fight. And after that, that boy and him were good friends.
Did his dad win the fight?
Oh yes, he whipped him, and because he was strong, having to use that one leg and his shoulders and arms so much did make him very strong.
I seem to remember he did pick on Dad before he picked on the other, and Dad let him until then.
Yes, he did. He didn't want to fight very much. But then, when he got into high school, sports attracted him terribly much. He wanted to play football, but his father put down his foot there and said no, he couldn't do that. So he wanted to go out for track. He was sure that he could do something in track. But when he went and applied, and it came time to pass out the shoes, the athletic shoes, the coach told him, no, he said, I can't waste them. He said, I have to give them to those that can really compete. And so Clayton bought his own track shoes. He practiced in his own backyard. And when it came time for them to try out for who was going to go to state, and the time came, Clayton entered, and they did let him. And when he beat them, did jump higher than the one that they thought was really going to take everything, that boy quit. And Clayton went to state.
Why did he quit?
And this was the state of Wyoming, and I think Laramie was where they went. He quit because Clayton beat him, and I guess he just thought
couldn't take
that
being
he
beat
couldn't
out
do
by
it.
someone who was crippled.
I guess that he might have had that idea. I'm not sure of that. I just leave that. But anyway, in this track meet, Clayton won second in high jump and second in shot put. There was 26 points, some way, taken from his school from that track meet of the state, and 25 of them, I believe, were Clayton's. This is the way I understand
it. Is this the state, you are talking about the state one?
Yes, well, the state of Wyoming.
What all did he
and I
compete in?
had the silver medals that he won.
I know, I've got them now, but he competed
in... As far as I know,
was
the only
jump,
two I know were the
high
ones he
jump,
won.
And shot put, that's what it was.
But anyway, he did win. And he felt very cocky when he went. And Clayton was used to being crippled. He was used to people saying things, and he didn't let it stop him or bother him at all. And when he said that when he started walking out with his school onto the field, that they began to chant in the stands and say, "What's the crip going to do? What's the crip going to do?" And he said, "I just thought I'd show him." So he said, "I just ran a few steps and jumped over the fence that was beside us." But before they were through with that track meet, they were all cheering for Clayton. Even though the ones that were in the school that finally won the first, they were still all cheering for Clayton.
Mama, how did Dad think that? Did they ever say? What did Grandma? What was it Grandma thought?
What?
Tell that about Grandma. Grandma thought it was because of a... Oh, I remember that.
Yes. Grandma thought, Clayton's mother, always said that it was a birthmark. To me, since I never believed in that, I didn't believe that it was.
But it could have been...
I said, what she told me was that she was that they were kind of poor and they had to burn everything that they could. So they would get the corn cobs after the pigs were through with them and let them dry out and use them for fuel. And she was then trying to gather up some of the corn cobs, and there was a sow in there that had a new batch of young ones. I don't know what they call them. But anyway, she said the sow chased her, and she tried to make it over the fence, and the sow grabbed at her heel just as she went over, and she always claimed that marked the baby. I used to try to think, well, maybe when she fell across the fence, she said she fell across it and hit her stomach pretty hard.
Well,
and
that would have been...
I thought that maybe it could have injured it. But no, many years later, after Clayton had done everything that any other man had ever done, he married, had children, grandchildren, did everything, and worked at a trade. And finally, they decided on the job to take X-rays, and he discovered that he only had one bone in his foreleg.
Wasn't it the smaller of the
And
two?
it was the smaller
of the two.
Of the two bones, and it just rested lightly on.
I remember he said, if I had known that early in life, I may not have done the things that I did.
Yes. Okay. Now you've got it. Just liked him. He always dated Clayton, and he could dance. He was a dancer, and they didn't turn Clayton down. He was a good dancer.
What else? What about his first dates? What about his first dates? Were there always dates?
I don't know about his first dates. I'm his wife.
I think I had that on pause all the time.
All his life, he had gone that way without a brace, without a build-up shoe or anything. He had just been Clayton. And his foot, of course, was deformed. It wasn't like an ordinary foot. And after he had grown grandchildren even, he finally did have to have a build-up shoe. In a way, it was good, and in a way, it wasn't. After he got used to the build-up shoe, when he'd take it off at night, and he would get awfully tired carrying that around, and when he'd take it off at night, he couldn't walk. He could hardly walk. And so I was glad to do things for him. I was so used to Clayton that I didn't even think about the fact that he was crippled. I remember we'd go to a strange town maybe, and people would be looking at us, and maybe I was self-centered, but I always thought my slip must be showing, or something like that. Well, it took a little bit for me to remember that Clayton was crippled.
Well, when I was little, real little, I remember walking along with Daddy, and little kids would always look at Daddy's foot. And I would look at the little kids, thinking, what's wrong with them? And I would look at Daddy's foot and think, oh, Dad's crippled. I would forget it.
Yeah. When someone is able to forget themselves, they're not apt to notice any of those hurtful things.
Yeah, and you forget those things too.
And it helps the other fellow to forget too.
Yeah, strange.
Because one didn't have to watch what they said around Clayton. I remember one time when his folks were telling me that I should be very careful of Clayton, that he was crippled. And I said, to you, he is a crippled man. But he's not to me. He's just like any other man, and that's the way he's going to be.
Well, I remember that when I found a picture, a very old and yellowed picture of Dad's family when he was a kid. Or I should say it had that brownish look that old pictures have. But
he was handsome.
You're right. I couldn't get over how handsome. I stared and stared and stared at it when I was a kid and thought, he's so cute. If he was in my class, I would think he was the best looking boy I'd ever seen.
It is our 50th anniversary together, and he lived 4 more years after that.
Well, I don't think it would hurt to say that Dad, that I know he didn't have trouble with girls, because I knew of the reputation of the Doty girls and their beauty. And Mother was right there for me to see. And I remember her shining hair long on her shoulders and bouncing when she walked, or springing. And she was a beauty, and everyone said it. Even when I became a teenager and people began to notice that I was growing into a young woman, men in the family, uncles, would say things like, oh, you're getting to be a pretty girl, Gloria, but you'll never see the day you're as beautiful as your mother was. So obviously Daddy didn't have much trouble with girls or getting dates. Daddy was valedictorian of his class, is that right? And he was in Douglas, Wyoming.
And he won a 4-year scholarship to college. In fact, you still have it, but you know that it isn't usable, but of course, but you have it. It's still here, you remember?
Yes, I have it, the certificate.
Victorian, did you say that?
Yeah, I said that.
Who could ever call Clayton a failure?
Dad was
and
a
I
success.
remember when at his funeral, and our pastor said, Clayton, I want you to know Clayton was not handicapped. Praise the Lord. I'm not. The year that I was 16, Edna married. You got that?
Mm-hmm.
And for some reason, Mama had never let me go anywhere unless I went with Edna. And so for a whole summer, a 16-year-old girl stayed at home on the island. I don't think anybody even knew I was alive. I could look over and see their buildings over there.
From
I could hear people talking sometimes and hear that. Because it was over water, I think, the voice carried. I know when I was over there, I could hear Mother sing, and she had a strong alto voice.
When you were over where?
At my aunt's across
The water? Oh. Well, there were no houses real near the river, I remember, so
Uncle
it
Bud
was
and Aunt
maybe a half mile.
And Uncle Jack and Aunt Bertha both lived over there.
About a half mile from the river, or more.
About a quarter of a mile.
Well, you said you'd climbed a tree, and you would sit up there and daydream and look across the river. Mother said she was
However,
always quite a dreamer.
When I started back to school that year, I just couldn't let anybody think that I had just been out of it. That camped up there and nobody had paid any attention to me. And so I told one of my girlfriends a big lie about myself. I acted like I'd had a big affair. And I told her all about it, and she was so interested and everything. And she informed me that she didn't think any the less of me. Although I did. I knew what a liar I had been. and that I wouldn't have done what I said for anything. Gloria is getting after me for not telling my life before Edna got married. It is true, one reason why it hurt so to be alone out there was that I had been going to dances with the girls and having dates and just feeling and having a good time. And I can remember dancing with one boy, and he told me that, he said, there's a lot of people inebriated here tonight. I didn't know what that meant. So I said, well, I don't know about that, but there's sure a lot of them intoxicated. They had told me how I should respond to things. And once one of the fellows told me that, well, he said the word right out, but he said that Edna was a big BSer. And I thought that was an awful word to use in front of me. And I said, sir, I want you to know that I'm a lady. Years later, when I told that to people, they just roared. I still think it was all right. And actually, I think that what she meant more to me than anything else.
Your special girlfriend.
At the time. Her name was Elizabeth. I was fortunate that she was a good girl. She taught me that when you went to a dance, you stayed in the hall. You never went out until the dance was over, because
Mother, did you tell
you've
how
got
you
a bad
met,
reputation
how you
that
and
way.
Elizabeth came to be friends?
I think so. Elizabeth was absolutely loyal. I knew that she would do anything to protect me. I remember one time in my foolishness, we took another girl home. There were 3 boys, and we took that other girl home. I had insisted on them taking me home first, and Elizabeth was so mad at me. We all got out at the other girl's place because, and then Elizabeth really did tell me off. Was you going to leave me with 3 boys after we took her home, and then you? And she said, and I would be left with the 3 boys.
What would have been so
We
bad about
walked
that when
about
you were...
6 miles back into town.
My goodness, Mother, what would have been so terrible about that?
She would have been scared to be with 3 boys.
Oh, some boys you were out with there, Mom.
No, they were nice. One time, we wore long skirts, and so one time, I didn't have any clean panties to put on, and I went to the dance anyway. But when I was coming home, I got to thinking about that, and it just scared me and worried me half to death. And finally I said, well, I'm going to walk. I said, the boys drove into a little place and
What
saw
worried you? That your pants weren't clean?
that I didn't have any pants on.
Oh!
Anyway, I said, I'm going to walk home. And I got out, and Elizabeth said, well, I'll go with you. And I said, when we got on the road and started walking home, the boys were dumbfounded. They hadn't done a thing. And Elizabeth said, what's the matter? What did he do? I said, he didn't do anything, but I haven't got on any pants.
What, you were afraid he'd write
Oh,
you fresh?
Elizabeth was so mad at me. She was to flog me. But she was a couple of years older than me. And I couldn't be expected to know everything, I guess. Mother didn't want me to go with Elizabeth. In fact, she stopped it. And that was the one reason why I didn't have any friends at that particular time. Elizabeth did tell untruths, and I knew that she did. But she also taught me so much that was good, and I loved Elizabeth. And Mama made a mistake when she stopped me from going with Elizabeth, because after that, I got in with the crowd that Winston I played hooky with for about a month straight. I played hooky with Elizabeth.
Oh.
She was older than me, and I just thought that I could.
Well, in a way, that sort of proves Grandma's point, though.
Huh?
It sort of proves Grandma's point.
I know that it seemed bad, and yet that had been along the first of our friendship. That wasn't later. And when Mama stopped me from going with her, Elizabeth had pride enough that when she found out that I was trying to hide it from Mama if I went anywhere with her, she wouldn't go with me. And that made me feel miserable. And so I went into a very bad time for a while.
I know how you must have felt.
The crowd that I went with if they did bad things, I really didn't know it. But I did know that they were kind of slipshod. I did know that people kind of looked down on them. Somehow I didn't feel like very important either. But I do remember walking along on the other side of the street, and a boy that I knew and had danced with quite a bit called me and said, "Will you come here? I want to talk to you." And when I got over there, he said, "Norma, what are you doing with that bunch? Do you know that walking along there, you look like a rose surrounded by a bunch of thorns? I don't know what you're thinking of." I was running with that crowd. I had a new girlfriend, but we were together all the time. And all at once she announced that they were going to move away from town. They were going to move to Caldwell. And I didn't know what in the world I'd do. Here I'd be again without a girlfriend.
Who
without
was that?
a special girlfriend. And so it was Charlotte. And so she talked to me, and this shows why they were the wrong class, I guess. They wanted me to go with them. And so I decided that I'd run away with them. And I didn't have any money, so her older brother paid my way. And he didn't have anything to do with us at the depot. And I know why now. He stayed clear away from where we were. And we got on there, the train, and went, and everything was happy. I wrote a letter to the folks and put it in our mailbox in town. And in it, I told them that I was grown up and that I would make my own way and all that bunch of nonsense.
Were you 16 or 17?
I was 16. And then I went to, on with her then, and we went out that evening. And we went to a Salvation Army place, of all things. We went, and it was a mission, and we went. And I began to be bluer than anything you ever thought of.
Where did you go to?
I wanted to go home. We were in Caldwell. I wanted to go home more than anything I ever wanted in my life. And I didn't know why I had left. These people weren't mine. They weren't even like my people. And when about 11 o'clock that night, after we had come back and was thinking about going
Mama,
to bed.
you told me that...
After we came back and was thinking about going to bed, here all at once there was a knock at the door. And it was my daddy. And he told me that he'd come after me. And I was never so happy to see anybody in my life. But then he did tell them that it was only for my sake that he didn't have that fellow arrested.
Well, Mama,
my way.
Did he join you later? You said you learned later why he wasn't with you at the depot. He joined you on the train?
No, he didn't. He just was at home when we got there. We came home. And Daddy, he put me in the back seat. He was with somebody. Daddy didn't have a car. And he was with the brother of the woman who told Daddy about it. And he covered me up. And the only thing he said to me was, "What have we done that you could do that to us?" And I said, it just nearly killed me to think about it. And all the way home, I didn't know what to do. And for some reason, he must have kept Mama from saying things to me because she didn't say anything to me. And the next morning I was up bright and early and I went down. I told Daddy, one thing I did tell Daddy. He said, "You not any word or anything?" I said, "Oh yes, Daddy, I did write your letter. I put it in the post office." And I said, I went early the next morning and I got that letter and I read it. And I never read anything so silly in all my life. And I just couldn't let him see it. I tore it up. I suppose I should have showed him to prove to him, but nevertheless, I tore it up. I had some funny things happen. I guess with that family, I made some of the funniest mistakes and breaks I had ever made in my life. I remember one time staying for supper. I had stayed too long. I shouldn't have stayed for supper. And one of the boys got up and kind of pushed his chair under the table and said, "Well, I guess I better go milk Stucky." And just then it dawned on me if it was time to do the chores, it was time for me to go home. So I got up and pushed my chair under the table and said, "Well, Stucky's going home." Then one of the boys was walking home from school with me one time, carrying my books, and as we walked along, I just happened to look down to the neck of my dress, and I saw I had a little fine fuzz just on my chest. And I said, and I was such a silly kid. I just grabbed my dress out and looked and said, "I didn't know I had hair on me down there before." boy. I remember that he walked over and laid my books on the side of the road, and then he just rolled.
Happy.
Better class. A girl came to town to live with her sister, and she was really quite a gal. And I knew that she was the dentist's sister-in-law, and she was a wonderful girl. And I was a pretty good girl too, although I had kind of run around with people that I shouldn't have. But Thelma and I got to be best friends, and that was pretty wonderful. And later on in life, we married brothers. I quit school again. I always did.
What grade were you in?
I was in the freshman year, and I went to work in a restaurant, and I felt pretty good in there. I was earning money, and I finally filled out and looked like I was somebody, and I could buy some clothes that I thought looked good on me.
What were the wages then?
I forget, about 40 cents an hour, I'm not sure. But in those days, you could buy something for that. But anyway, there was some fellows come to town working on the highway. They were working for the state of Oregon on the highway, and one of the fellows was acted very interested in me. I heard later that he said, told one of the fellows he was with, "There's Mrs. Merle. I'm going to marry that girl." And he began asking me for a date, and I could tell he was terribly interested in me. And I was such a foolish girl. But I decided that I'd go with him. And we went to a movie, I remember. And the movie was about someone that was such a butterfly, she was really silly. Very much like me. But he said, "You wouldn't be like that, would you?" And I said no, because I knew somehow from the way he was talking that he wouldn't like that. And so he asked me to marry him the very next day. That was so foolish. No, we waited 2 or 3 days, and I was afraid that he wouldn't come. I thought that he wouldn't come, but he did. And we started out to go to Vail. That was our county seat, so we could get married. And we stopped on the way. Edna was working in the country there for some people, and we picked her up and took her with us. That's my sister, to get married. And we were kind of excited. And we stood up the wrong way, and Edna was on the side where she would be married to Smiley. But the man changed us, the preacher changed us and put us on the right side. And so then we went home. Troba was sitting out in the yard on the lawn. She was about 13 or 14 and kind of at the gangly stage. Girls nowadays look different at 14, but Troba looked kind of gangly. And I said, "Troba, this is your new brother." "Oh, it is not," she said. "It is not." She wouldn't let me tell her that it was, because she just knew it wasn't. And then we went in, and my folks were down in the basement. They had the summer kitchen down there and dining room down there. And I told him to wait, that I'd go and tell them. And so I went running down there, and I said, "Come up and meet my new husband." And they were flabbergasted too, and they didn't believe it. But they did come up, and Mama wouldn't. Mama wouldn't come up. She said she didn't believe it, she wouldn't come up, and she was hurt. But Daddy did. And Daddy, he shook hands with Smiley, and he said, "Well, I want you to know you got a good girl." And Smiley said, "Well, she got a pretty good man, too." I hadn't even realized what my last name was. His name was Hubert Merle, and I was calling him Merle around there. And he said, "Why do you call me by my last name?" And I said, "Oh, I didn't. Is that your last name?" And he said, "Yes, it's yours too." And I said, "Well, what's your first name?" And he told me, but he told me Hubert, but he said, "Everybody calls me Smiley." And so after that, I called him Smiley. It was funny, but he went back to town to stay because there was really no place for him to stay. And he went there, and I guess the guys teased him and got him drunk and everything. And then he came back the next night and really met my folks. But first my mother, I remember her. She was over sitting on the neighbor's porch, and she was crying, and they said, "What's the matter, Mrs. Doty?"